This is Tell Me What It's Like, a show about life-changing decisions, extraordinary challenges, and defining moments. I'm Stacey Rain. Many people still remember exactly where they were the morning of 9/11. I was at the gym on a treadmill and I turned on the TV, and I can remember seeing some confusing images, just smoke coming out of a high-rise building. And then I heard the news anchors sharing what they knew in real time. Carol Lynn was one of those anchors, and in fact, she was the first to break the news to America that the World Trade Center had been hit by a plane. During her time as a correspondent and anchor, Carol guided us through moments like that, the ones that were defining and traumatic and historical. And behind the scenes, Carol was also navigating both professional and personal highs and lows, which she details in her new book, When News Breaks, a memoir of love and war. Carol, welcome to the show.
Hi, Stacey. Pleasure to be here.
I am thrilled to have you, and I am thrilled that I had the chance to read your new book. When I first heard about you, I thought, we're going to talk about 9/11. You were the one that broke the news to all of us. What an impact you had on so many people's lives. You were part of that moment that we all still remember. Then I read your book, and there's so much to talk about. So let's start right there with that moment of 9/11. You were at CNN, you were in Atlanta, and you went to work. Can you tell me what happened next?
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. It's a question that's going to conjure up a lot of memories because this year, 2026, is the 25th anniversary of 9/11,
Amazing.
if you can believe it. And yet, for those of us who remember it, it's as if it happened yesterday. It's something I write about in When News Breaks, the behind the scenes of a very quirky morning at CNN, actually. It was a morning where we were at an inflection point. The morning show, for me, I was the anchor, but potentially about to lose my position at the network because we were facing stiff competition from all the other morning shows. Commercial television was becoming a reality for CNN. And so I was getting ready to interview author Amy Tan about her new cartoon series on PBS, Sagwa, if any one of us remember that as kids. And all of a sudden, there was an executive who ran behind me to the control room. We were in a commercial break. And Stacey, nobody runs in the CNN newsroom. That newsroom is wired for breaking news. Breaking news is what we lived for. It was our
Right.
DNA, right? The most natural thing to do. But she was running, and I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "Unconfirmed reports of a plane into the World Trade Center." And I thought, small plane.
Yeah.
It had to be a small plane. And then my executive producer gets in my earpiece and says, "Get back to the anchor set," because I was in a remote position in the newsroom, being all casual. And I went the however 20, 30 feet back to the anchor desk, and I took my seat, and I could see what's called the preview monitor in the anchor desk, which is what you, the viewer, were going to see once we came out of commercial break or broke into commercial. And it was an astonishing visual to see this giant gaping hole in the World Trade Center. And then I hear the music, the breaking news animation comes up, and we are live. Teleprompter goes blank, and I have no information. And the weight of responsibility, I don't want to say anything stupid. Honestly, that was my first thought.
Oh.
I don't know anything. You, the viewer, don't know anything. We only know what we can see. But behind the scenes, the machinery of CNN is working. I know that the international desk, which was to my right, and the control room, which was in my ear, was going to start feeding me information, the national desk as well. But you've got those first critical moments. And this is a clip, if you Google CNN 9/11 or Carol Lynn 9/11, you're going to see that iconic clip, which has been in a number of documentaries and Hollywood films. It is so iconic with those first words, "This just in." And we go into what's called rolling coverage. And that means I know that the first thing that the control room and the network is going to try to do is get eyewitness accounts. And it was that first eyewitness account by a CNN vice president of finance in New York who was in a conference room in a high rise with a line of sight to the World Trade Center in a meeting. And he was the first to confirm that this was a passenger jet. And that's when we knew that this was no ordinary story, Stacey. It
And
was a crazy morning.
you're figuring it out for us and sort of telling us. I mean, I just can't imagine. I remember turning on the screen and thinking, or did I turn on the wrong channel? I think I was trying to watch a morning show. I was like, what have I turned this on?
Right.
I can't imagine you're trying to make sense of it and then telling us. But you also mentioned in your book, and often you talk about, it's a whole team. It's not just you. Mm. So you had people with you trying to help you while you were there. Do I have that right?
Yes. Broadcast journalism is a team sport. I would estimate that behind every correspondent or anchor, there are at least 30 people in the newsroom alone helping with the news gathering. So making phone calls, gathering correspondents who are also gathering information. So you have to trust the team behind you because it's your face, it's your voice, but it's the network that you represent. And what was interesting, Stacey, on that particular day, and I didn't remember it until I was actually writing this chapter in the book, but it was largely an all-female team in the control room. It was Jody Fleissig in my ear. It was, Sonia Houston or Jen Marinowski or all these women who were in the leadership positions in the newsroom on that day, which I think is really cool.
Yeah.
Right? And they are just, it's like if you could imagine Jody, the executive producer who's in the book and who was leading the control room that day, she used to describe producing live breaking news or a newscast. It was like music. So in her mind, it's like the pacing of it and the collaboration, the different notes and beats. But in breaking news, it is very much a team sport. It's like the Super Bowl, watching the field and the trust that the quarterback has to have that, she's not going to get tackled or taken out, that they're not going to leave you high and dry. And that was never the case. It's the most amazing feeling to be on live television, but have the network have your back.
I can imagine. I think the very last page in the acknowledgments, you said the audience should know there are at least 30 field, show team, and editorial producers supporting a single correspondent. And you list a bunch of them. I thought, wow, I had no idea that was so many people go into just the one person we see on television. That was fascinating to me.
So the breakout, and I only named the women because I realized, wow, I worked with a lot of incredible women.
Yeah.
And the people represented in that list, they are executive producers. They're executives in the C-suite. They're executive producers. They're show team producers. They're writers. They're guest bookers. There's a whole, you can, if there was an aerial view of this activity, people are just news gathering in a dynamic fashion, calling sources, booking guests, getting what are called beepers, which are the phone interviews on live television, the fastest way you can get a story from the ground out there. Phone calls were being made from around around the world, to bureaus in London. Nick Robertson, who happened to be reporting from Afghanistan at the time. Obviously, the big names, Christiane Amanpour, Wolf Blitzer, and so on and so forth. But it's also, the unsung heroes, the field crews who were heading to Ground Zero, right? So people are fleeing the scene. You have camera crews and producers and reporters who are heading to the scene, and without a hesitation, because that's where the story's happening. That's where we've got to figure out, what are we going to do next?
And you were always going to the scene. I mean, this was not, this was obviously 9/11 was huge and new. Something like that magnitude was new for everyone, but you were pretty used to going into these dangerous places and being where the news was happening. And so that's one thing that I really enjoyed about your book, is getting the behind the scenes of how news happens. I was at one point wanted to be a reporter, and I did not, but I finally got to see into that world, which was really fun. But you mentioned at some point in the book, towards the end, when you started journaling, and it was not while you were a reporter. Yet you are so detailed in this book about what it was like back then. I was curious how you recalled all this stuff if you weren't even journaling.
Yeah, it's so I think the difference between memoir and autobiography, and not to have a teaching moment here, but just to
Hmm.
point out that memoir is memory. And through the process of memory, you realize that certain scenes are forever going to be embedded in our hearts and minds. They're
Hmm.
unforgettable to us as individuals. And when you go into the process of recollection, and at least I had archival footage, I had
Yeah, that's true.
stories on DVDs that I could look at and so on and so forth. But there are moments in life that are unforgettable, not because they happened, because this is not the story of a journalist, and I know we're going to get into that, but this is the story of a woman who is trying to figure out who she really is in when she lives in the gaze of others. And
Yes.
so I think when I went through that process of, well, why did I go into this crazy career? Because it was so unsuited to me in so many ways. And why did I fall in love with that guy
Hmm.
and why did I stay with him? And how did we create a life? And how did we decide to create life? And I think for any of us, but especially women, I think when we think about these decisions, they're very vivid. I mean,
Hmm.
Stacey, you were telling me off camera that moment when that college advisor was telling you not to be a reporter. And
Right.
that's like it
It is
happened
vivid.
yesterday.
Yeah.
You could write in great detail about that because that was a turning point in your life. Someone was trying to help you make the right decision, but in the end, maybe it was the wrong decision. And why did I allow that to happen? Or maybe I could change that. And see, so you remember, I bet you remember exactly what he looked like and the tone of voice and where you were standing and how it made you feel.
Yeah.
And because that was important to you. And so I think in writing memoir, it's not the documentation of my life, but it is the why the heck, what happened
Hmm.
when, and how did that really feel? And why did I end up staying? And so on and so forth. And I think that's the journey of this story.
Right. I mean, there was so much in here. It wasn't just, the your days with CNN and your time as a correspondent. It was your whole life in a package. And I heard that you wrote this primarily for your daughter. You weren't even necessarily intending to publish it at first. Um,
Mhm.
I'm curious, at what point did you decide, maybe I'll share this book?
After she read the manuscript. So
Really?
the backstory on that, Stacey, is that I had started these pages shortly after I left CNN, and then when I met Mike, whom you meet in the last chapter,
Hmm.
I set it aside because I didn't want to dive so deeply into the past when I was looking towards my future. And so when I revisited it all these years later, the motivation is watching my daughter go through some of the major decision points that I had made in my life, for better or worse. And I was trying to advise her. And then it made me think, well, what was my why? And what does she need to know about her biological father and my past to help her understand that making mistakes or rather that you're not going to be defined by your worst mistake, that
Hmm.
perfection is the enemy of a great life. And in fact, imperfection is the journey to becoming the person you need to be. And so you have to make those mistakes and you learn resilience through that. And so in writing these pages, it was really to understand my own story so that I could help her through hers. And then she read it and I was in a writing course, and part of that writing course was to guide you through the initial stages of getting an agent and publishing and so on and so forth. So I kind of liken writing this book because people have mentioned how raw and
Hmm.
honest and open it is. And gosh, wasn't it hard, Carol, to be that candid about these very personal aspects of what happened in your career and life? And I said, honestly, I liken it to breastfeeding. When you first start, it's a little awkward and very private. And then after a while, before you walk out the front door, you have to check to make sure that you're wearing your top because it's become so natural to
Yeah.
kind of have everything out there that you have to make sure you're contained when you go in public. And I think after a while, slowly as beta readers were helping me refine some of the pages, and the more I went through the revision process, and then finally getting it to Chloe and having her read, and we had this big 2-hour conversation about the book and the story, and her conclusion is, Mom, I'm really proud of you. Thank you for doing this, and you've got to do this for yourself. So let's see what it does in the world.
Yeah.
Stacy, women are reading this book, and I'm getting direct messages and I'm getting emails from former colleagues, and they're so incredibly beautiful. These women, these professional, high performing women who are telling me their story, challenges in their marriages, or
Mm-hmm.
questions about the decisions they made about their career, or should they have left sooner? Should they have stayed longer? And that's the richness of this book. I think this is a book that's allowing women to hear their own voice about their own decisions. And then when we reconnect, whether it's these parasocial relationships through social media or personal relationships reconnected, it's incredible to be in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean the book is it's such a journey. I mean, you talk about your career and how you got there and some of these incredibly brave moments, but then you talk about falling in love and marriage and infidelity and having a baby. And at the same time that you are pregnant and about to have Chloe, your husband gets sick with cancer, and you go through this incredibly emotional journey with the reader of you were always sort of determined in everything you did, and the determination of, well, he's going to be fine. We're going to fix this. This is what we do. Um, Through the entire journey until he ultimately passes away, I had to stop reading at one point because I was on the verge. I mean, I did cry when but I was like, I can't
Mm.
cry at this moment, so I'm gonna have to stop reading. But it was so generous, I guess, with the reader. Just you let us in fully, but it must have been really hard to. I mean, you basically had to go back to the worst moments, as you said.
Hmm. And do it in a way that's not horrifying to the reader.
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
mean, do it in a way where I hope that you could connect as the reader to the times when your best friend might have been diagnosed,
Hmm.
or um, the hope that we have. When you live a life where you have goals and you strive and you meet those goals and you become very target oriented, as I did,
Hmm.
that cancer becomes, we can fix this, right? We can fix this. And I think the metaphor of 9/11 was that there is grief and loss, and life can come from that. But at
Mm.
the same time, um, time becomes a theme, right? So, there's this metaphor of time and how a reporter looks at time, and the countdowns that happen in the story, or the moment of 9/11 right before impact. And when Will tells me that it's cancer, um, I distinctly remember that as the before and the after, right?
Yeah.
So, when someone you love tells that they have cancer, um, your world changes. Our world changed. My world changed, and I looked at everything in the context of time. I remember on that drive home, because he told me when over the phone, I was driving back from a lunch. I remember things, Stacy, like looking at real estate signs and
Hmm.
thinking, by the time that house sells, where are we going to be? I started
Hmm.
looking at everything in terms of increments of time, every sunrise, every sunset. I was exquisitely aware of time passing, and wondering whether the gift of time was that gift, or whether it was the countdown
Mm.
to a tremendous loss. And this career, by then, I had been so conditioned to never taking no for an answer. You can't afford for someone to tell you no. No, I can't do the interview. No, I've got to convince you to do that interview because I'm on deadline. And I got
Hmm.
used to this outsized sense of being able to accomplish the impossible, being able to do a fully produced story in a matter of hours. and overcoming the odds every day. I wanted cancer to be that same kind of um, obstacle I could overcome. And, I do reference it in the book like, hey, we're CNN. I know Sanjay Gupta. We're going to get the
Mm-hmm.
best care possible. And that sounds so privileged. It sounds so elitist when I think about it. But by that time in my career, I had been subliminally convinced that I can do this. I can be the God of my story. I can be the God in my husband's cancer journey. And there comes a point of reckoning, and at what price? People who have been caregivers are so exquisitely aware of what's happening in those chapters, and they say to me, "Oh no, Carol, no, no, please don't do
Mm,
that," because we were just reaching for every possibility that he was going to live.
right.
When people who've walked this journey before understand that there's going to be a point where we have to let go, and it's the inevitability of it. And I think that's how I wanted to write those chapters, because so that there was your reaction was not only going to be sympathy, but there was going to be empathy and connection with people who've walked that walk.
Absolutely.
Because right, yeah. So
And you had just given birth when this is when you make this when you have this realization, when the last sort of test isn't the outcome you wanted, and you said this is, I think, something like the end of the road for this journey, and you have to process that, but you're also processing being a mom. Um, I've only done one of those two things, and so I'm sitting here thinking, how do you walk through this excruciating loss while also taking care of this tiny baby, and you have all of these sort of new mother feelings that range, they run the gamut.
yeah.
I was so emotional reading that for you, and
Mm.
thinking about the juxtaposition. You're very candid about your mental health after that, and trying to figure out how to walk this path, I guess.
Mhm.
You're very open about that with the reader, which I appreciated,
Mhm.
because
Thank you.
it was hard to imagine. I mean, I imagined it because you wrote it, but it was hard to just even process the depths that you must have been feeling, and sort of the juxtaposition of these two different life events.
Yeah.
You mentioned at some point um, how you were very used to reporting the news and being stoic and being a part of, you're reporting on other people's horrible, traumatic moments, and then suddenly you're in your own. Did you think about that in those moments?
Oh, yes. Very much so. I talk about live shots. When you plan a live shot, how do you go live? How do you report breaking news? And my theory or my methodology as a journalist was, if I know where I'm going to end in my live shot, the middle will work out itself. So
Mm-hmm.
where I begin and where I end are the most important brackets in a successful live shot, because you always worry what's going to happen in the middle, and you've got a time keep, and it's a very strict 60-second live shot, and you've got to get a lot of information in. But in life, you don't know where it's going to end. There's no framework. I have no framework for being a mother. I never changed a diaper. I never held a baby. I didn't live in a world of mothers and babies. I lived in a world of men, and though I worked with some really great women, it was largely a male dominated industry. So it was a male mindset going to work. And I wasn't supposed to be the mother. Will was supposed to be the parent. I had this kind of crazy idea that, okay, I could gestate, I could have this baby, I could give this baby to him. I was largely having a baby because my husband wanted a baby, and I
Yeah.
felt it was what I could do for him at the time for all these different reasons. And then I would just go back to work, Stacey, right?
Yeah.
I didn't know. And here I was, and God laughed.
Mm.
And I was going to be the mother, and I was going to be the everything to this child, and I didn't know how. And I think it was one foot in front of the other. I remember at the time I would talk my way through the day. verbally. I was
Mm,
living my own live shot. I would
yeah.
say, get up, Carol, walk to the crib. And she was crying, it was time to get up. And I would talk myself through my day. So I was like this living, breathing live shot without really understanding where it was going to end. And I think it's only in hindsight do I realize that it's the generous community around me that through my career sometimes I didn't recognize because you think even though it's a team sport, but at the same time as a correspondent, you become very singularly mindset and you are an army of one because essentially when that camera goes on, you trust your team, but it is you on the front line. It is you
Mm-hmm.
on the camera. And in life, that is not the case. What gets you through the grief is going to be your community. And I love being able to write when news breaks because I want it to be that acknowledgement and that thank you note to the people who were always there, but in ways beyond the work, right? So, um, how do you get through it? Any survivor of divorce or cancer caregiving or a job loss understands that walk. It's very similar. It's
Yeah.
very similar. And I really salute resilience and people who choose survivorship and to honor their community.
And you detail that very clearly. You really talked about your community. You foreshadowed it. You talked about how important they were. And then you detailed how they came through for you. I mean, um, you detailed how they kept your fridge full and they would hold Chloe for you. And it was a beautiful tribute to them. I thought you were going through this at the same time as becoming a new mother, which was something that I have experience with.
Mhm.
And so a little, you've got a lot going on that you're processing, but you mentioned a story that, um, you went to a mommy and me class and you realize your sweater's on.
What a dis-
Yeah. But it was like the
it
first
was a
time.
disaster.
Yeah, I mean, but it was the first time. Not only are you leaving the house as a new mom, but you're a grieving widow, and not everybody knew you. And your sweater was on inside out and backwards, and I was like, well, I understand that.
You can relate.
Yeah, not. I mean, but then you had this whole other thing on top of it, which you talk about that moment and how that comes to play. But it was so candid, and I appreciate that. You were also really candid about career and motherhood, which, as you just said, this was really something that your husband Will wanted, and then suddenly you're a single mom, and you have to. They're calling you saying, "Hey, what do you want to do?" How did you decide to go back, at least for a time, to CNN?
Clearly, I did not have my mother brain yet, Stacy,
Mm,
because my default was once again, work.
yeah,
And I thought, what's the solution to this problem? I am beyond sad that everything around me, everywhere, reminds me of Will.
yeah,
A chipped coffee cup, right? Or
mm-hmm.
walking down a street, or the dream that we had for the home that we were going to return to someday. Everything around me was a reminder of our life together. So when I was asked by CNN, what do you want to return to after your maternity leave? And I said, there's an opening in the Jerusalem Bureau. How about you assign me to the Middle East? Okay, so Stacey, here's my logic as the reporter. Okay, the
Yeah,
reporter says, it's a big story, so that's good for my career. It's not a traveling bureau, so I can be home
yeah,
with the kid. And it's a family-centric culture. And none of this is saying, well, Carol, there's a war going on,
right,
right?
exactly.
There are people losing loved ones every single day. Is that the best place for you to heal? And it was a journey through that decision. And as you know, there's a turning point in the book because there comes to be a point where I have to fully understand my relationship with this baby. Everything. I think my way of dealing with grief was to sort and compartmentalize and be logical like a reporter,
Mm-hmm.
information gather, sort, and report. Um, I was I was so filled with grief that there wasn't the space to really understand what it is to love a baby.
Right.
And that decision to want to go to the Middle East was part of this turning point and this reckoning of understanding what it is to be a parent. And look, there are mothers who go to the Middle East.
Yeah.
There are female correspondents who have children. I'm not saying that. And this is not a Hallmark special where, the girl from the big city goes home and marries the hometown boy and that solves her problem. That's not what I want this story to be. It's to understand who I had become at that point, all the social conditioning that had happened to make me believe that my career was my salvation, um, that is unique to me, um, that guided me ultimately to a new decision that was contrary to what the world said. The world said, "You've worked so hard to attain this career. This is who you are." But who I had become was not the person I needed to be. And in talking to women about this book at book clubs or book events, they tell me about their own reckoning, their own turning points
Mm-hmm.
where they had to set aside their thriving business or their legal career or their, chance at partnership because the decision to have a family and how they wanted to be a mother was
Yeah.
in direct conflict, right? And we can't reconcile that even if we have a partner. That's the push and pull that I think we all feel. And we figure it out. And sometimes we even make it look pretty good on the surface. But what I'm discovering is that underneath many of us, there is this roiling. Sometimes it's regret,
Yeah.
sometimes it's a yearning, sometimes it's a revelation that now is my time, right?
Mm-hmm.
The kids are out of the house, and by God, I'm not going to leave this planet until I achieve my dream. And it's interesting that it's. I talk to men about this book too, but they have a completely different experience with it. So I love hearing from other women about how this when news breaks for them, how they think it through, right? And
Yeah.
that's the very intentional titling of the book because it's not about yes, it's about journalism, but it's about how we meet the moment.
Yeah.
What are you going to do?
I'm glad you mentioned the title of the book and also the cover. The cover does not have you're not on it in as a photo, which would have been what I expected when I heard you were writing a book. And it's also a memoir of love and war. And war was not just war in the sense that we think about it. It was also in these battles that you were having personally with cancer, as you talked about, and infidelity and all of these things. But when you decided on the cover, you didn't put yourself on it. Can we talk about that? Why did you make that decision?
Because I think even before I think I knew that this wasn't about me, that the story was going to be about the readers seeing
Mm-hmm.
themselves. And the symbolism of the bracelet, the piece of jewelry, and you can
Yes.
see that something happened. And the the jade is a character in the book. There's a
Mm-hmm.
thread of this jade that was passed from my grandmother to my mother and eventually to me, and what happens and why when in Chinese culture, a happy occasion of a woman getting married is touched with the possibility that she could also lose everything. And what would she have? What is her safety net? And in my Chinese culture, the safety net for a bride was the jewelry that she could break apart if the day came in order for her to survive. And so, as much as my mother would love that piece of jade that she received from her mother, she knew that she would have to sacrifice, if necessary, for whatever reason, for something that happens in her life that she has no control over. And I think that's the thread that runs through the book. What are we willing to give, what to get? What are we willing to sacrifice to move forward? And the gifts that our mothers give us, even when we don't know at the time they're gifts. Because my mother is quite the character in the book.
She is, yeah.
Fortunately, she's comic relief. These themes sound so heavy, but Joanne just kind of carries us through the moment,
Yeah,
and yeah, taught me a lot about love.
I think so. You talk a lot about your relationship with her and your sort of your feelings on what you think she feels about you, especially before you have your daughter. And then she gives you that bracelet at the moment where you started to give her a window into these thoughts that you'd had with, these thoughts that you'd had about what she feels about you. Um, and I was in that room. I could see it so clearly, her reaching out for you, and you're starting to push her away, and she hands you this bracelet. Um, I'm curious, did you ever talk about that moment with her later?
That's a good question. I think with my mother, because she was an immigrant and
Hmm.
she had very specific ideas of what she thought would keep me safe navigating in American society, we wouldn't speak directly about things, but we would speak around these things, right? I had written about her that she shows her love through her actions, not her words, that she
Hmm.
didn't trust words, that she didn't want me to become a journalist because she said words can lie and you can be misinterpreted. And as an immigrant who had survived the McCarthy era in the United States, um, she wanted to make sure that I was rooted in something solid, and what
Hmm.
was expected of me, like the sciences, or yeah, for her it was the sciences because that was her background.
Yeah.
So we didn't talk directly about it, but I knew how precious this piece of jewelry was to her. And before I knew the whole backstory, I knew she kept it in a safety deposit box. She never wore it.
Yeah.
She felt that she couldn't afford to lose it. And because it tied her so directly to her own mother, whom she had to wait decades to ever see again, and also her daughter. And so I think when she gave me that bracelet, it didn't need to be a discussion because I knew that she was giving me a part of her and her history that was beyond anything that we could say to each other.
Yeah. It seemed to me it sort of connected you two back when you were trying to push her away when you really needed her quite a bit. It was at um, during during his last days, and you were at his
Yeah.
bedside. It was beautifully written, and I I appreciated that you shared that moment with you and your mom because it was so personal, like this whole book. I I'm curious. So eventually, you go back to CNN. You've talked about this. You had to make these big decisions, and you eventually left. Um, and I want to know how the leaving. I mean, obviously, being a correspondent and becoming the correspondent you became, you learned a ton from that. But what did you end up learning once you left?
That you are more than your worst mistake, and that you are going to go through moments that break you, and you are going to find your resilience there again. You just have to give yourself a chance. You have to walk the walk. That's what everybody said about grief. And I'm like, I don't want to walk the walk,
Yeah,
but you have to walk the walk. And when you do, you will surprise yourself. And that is the amazing journey of looking back at something. Give yourself a chance to see yourself in the not in the lens of the camera, but in the rearview mirror, and appreciate yourself. It's not the things that you didn't get to do, but the things that formed you to who you are today and can prepare you for tomorrow. But you can only see that in hindsight. And I wouldn't wish this experience on anyone. But at the same time, I'm so thankful, not only for the opportunity to write this book, but to give encouragement to people who are in the throes of their own breaking news right now.
mm,
And also to at least have life perspective on all those stories that seem so transactional in the past, to appreciate the victims of crime, but the survivors of tragedy. And I want
yeah,
to go into, this 25th anniversary of 9/11 with that mindset, because we look at that day with so much grief and loss and sorrow, and we honor the dead. But there are some amazing stories of survival, and resilience that also um, have come from that deep tragedy for our nation. And I think that is where the opportunity is, that there are always two sides to a story. There's the dark and then there's the light. And in these times, I think we all know what I'm talking about when I say that we have to seek the light
Hmm.
because there is no alternative. And that will give us the chance to look in hindsight and appreciate all that we have.
Absolutely. It reminds me of what Will asked for you when you said to him, "What am I going to do?" And he asked you to be happy. And that was the
Yeah.
advice that you had to go back to those words when you were figuring out your next steps. Um,
Yeah.
and I really loved that Will was still guiding you because you talked about he was such a motivation for you throughout your career, um, and that he was still guiding you.
Yeah. Yeah. My publisher in the process of the final edits just noted how intertwined work and our love story
Yeah.
are. Even the love letters that I included, he used television as metaphors for his feelings.
Yes.
And, the fact that we were going to be finally in the same city together early in our romance. And work and love and family, for us, Stacy, it's all one, right? So I want you to put your resume reel together or whatever it is that the kids do today. I
Yeah.
want you to go out and get that reporting career.
Well, thank you. And Carol, thank you so much for joining me on this show. I really appreciate it. I thoroughly loved reading your book, and I loved getting the chance to talk with you.
You too. Stacy, thanks for all you do for supporting new writers and people telling their stories and just sharing the human experience. I love it.
Appreciate it. Thanks to Carol Lynn for joining me on Tell Me What It's Like. If you like this episode, please leave a review in your app. On the next episode, you'll hear from Kristen Martis on government assistance when you need it the most. I'm Stacey Rain. Thanks for listening.